I've never been able to come back here. This river is where we were given our miracle. I thought we would have a different life. I thought I would be a different woman.
Dos oruguitas enamoradas pasan sus noches y madrugadas llenas de hambre. Siguen andando y navegando un mundo que cambia y sigue cambiando. Navegando un mundo que cambia y sigue cambiando.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of ERG PowerTalk. I am your host, Joe Santana. That clip was from the 2021 movie Encanto. The clip shows the grandmother who's recalling how she was traumatized by the violent loss of her husband and how it led her to place immense pressure on maintaining perfection and control over everyone in her family. And this fear shaped her family in a number of ways that stifled their individuality. It created all kinds of tensions within the family. And it provides an example of how trauma can pass from a parent to a child, and then from that child to their children and grandchildren and so forth. And while this beautiful little animated movie is fictional, the impact of generational trauma that's highlighted within it is not fictional. The question is, what happens when the trauma suffered by members of your communities come into contact with all the chaos that we're living in today? What shape do these aggravated traumas take, and what can you do as ERG leaders to help your communities address these challenges? That is our topic for today, and to help us, we have the perfect guest. But before we introduce our guest, let's take a moment to review our mission and acknowledge our supporters. This is ERG PowerTalk, and I'm your host, Joe Santana. The purpose of ERG PowerTalk is to provide a virtual forum for the exchange of great ideas and inspiration for ERG leaders as well as others interested in supporting ERGs. With ERG PowerTalk, there is no more waiting until the next conference and praying that you get the budget to travel to the conference to find great ideas and stimulation toward action. Just subscribe and listen at your convenience. Before we begin, a quick note of thanks to our supporters: Atrium Health, Freighted Health and Wisconsin Medical College, Hiscox, Lee Health, National Audubon Society, Tapestry, Oshkosh Corporation, UL Solutions, and Sony Pictures Entertainment. Now, let's go straight to the program. She is a relentless professional who brings a powerful blend of lived experience, research, and policy expertise to the fight against trauma and inequality. Her work is rooted in understanding how trauma shapes lives, communities, and the institutions around us.
Thanks for having me. My name is Kenisha Coon. I am the founder and principal consultant for Kenisha Coon Consulting.
Kenisha, thank you for joining us today on ERG Power Talk. So let's get started with really just the general definition. First, what do you define as trauma? What is trauma? And when you refer in your work to generational trauma, I think I touched on that a little bit, but I'd love to have a more formal definition from you.
When I think about trauma, it's definitely the things that have happened to you, that you've experienced. So it could be inherited, and it's not only experienced, right? That Encanto clip was a perfect example about that, but it's something that can be inherited. We think about transmission of emotional wounds and survival behaviors, and systemic oppression is huge. Those effects across generations, things that have happened to us, whether we were growing up, what has happened pushed on us by society, those really affect and tie into what generational trauma really is.
Can you give us an example of, let's say, a generational trauma?
This is something I've worked a lot in therapy about. But you might have triggers that happen. For example, when I experience a hard time or I see someone being hurt, like it takes me back sometimes to when I've been in that situation with my growing up in the abused and neglected home that I grew up into. I'll get like flashbacks to things that had happened to me. And I'm like, whoop, hold on, let me come back into the present moment and know that I'm not in that past moment at that time. On a larger scale, I can tie it back to systemic racism, right? So historical injustices, racism, colonization, genocide, systemic inclusion, if we're looking at more the big picture of how our society was built. But there's those personal and things that hit you for how you work through your life on an everyday basis. And then there's those large scale historical injustices that come into play too.
Yeah, I hear that. And the story that I was thinking about is a story that someone told me about how their father and their grandfathers distrusted banks. And the reason why they distrusted banks was because the great grandfather lost some money during the Depression and they were left destitute. So they were taught this lesson of you keep your money close to you. So this guy was saying that his father used to actually have a safe in his home where he kept money from his business rather than putting that money in a bank, because even though their FDIC insurance and all this stuff came into play, this guy still had a fear of banking. And to your point, that same kind of effect can be produced by just about any experience that not only we've had, but that our parents or our parents' parents have had. And they're taught like in these little subtle lessons. They're almost like cautionary tales, or the way that they behave or the way that they respond to things that we are talking about when we're younger. And without ever having a conversation that says, hey, Kenisha, be afraid of this, don't do this, don't do that. They're transmitting that stuff. So yeah, so really powerful stuff. So Kenisha, how does that trauma and generational trauma, either personal trauma or generational trauma, how does that show up in the workplace?
Another piece of trauma that I experienced that goes into how it shows in the workplace is I am a Black biracial woman that grew up in an all-white home with no exposure to my Black culture at all. So with that, growing up and going through work came a lot of imposter syndrome and code switching, and a lot of mistrust in how I was supposed to act or how I was supposed to present, and a lot of identity issues that I've worked through over the years. But it was a trauma response for me to code switch or try to work through that imposter syndrome to act a certain way. And things that came out of that for me and how it showed up was perfectionism. Like straight A's, always have to be the best at everything that I do. I want to be a goal getter. I'm very type A. And sometimes the perfectionism can take over you a little bit and you get burnt out, and then you don't have time or you have a bad work-family balance. So I really focus on this when I do a lot of coaching and evidence-based coaching research for my PhD right now, and I run ERG stuff and I run coaching and leadership cohorts, and we talk a lot about that. How can we push past the imposter syndrome and that perfectionism of having to be the people pleaser and really hone in on what our overall mission is and how we can get there in a different way?
As you were talking about that, I was thinking, and I'm sure you've heard this expression before, how many times I've heard people say things like, because I am, and you could fill in the blank, whatever that is, gender or an ethnicity or a race, I have to work twice as hard
Yes.
in order to prove myself. I have to show even more dedication. When you hear that, you always think, my God, what a burden that person carries. Imagine indexing off of other people and saying, what are they doing? I have to do twice as good. What are the metrics here? The metric is to reach this. I've got to get up here. I've got to get like higher than that. And that's always struck me that there's a certain unfairness to that.
Yep.
It's like there is a certain unfairness to that. And it must take a toll.
Yeah, it does. And the societal pressures are on you like all the time. So it does take a toll. And I've learned some coping skills for that, planning out my days a little bit better, although I'm still hustling and working probably 2.5 full-time jobs to get where I want to be as an author and a speaker and all the things. I have to know that also I'm a mom, I'm a partner, I have friends, I have volunteer things I want to do, and it doesn't have to be all about getting to the top. Right. So it's been some work and I struggle with it on the daily, but I have gotten past the part of code switching. That's not something I do all the time. I really don't, very rarely ever. When I'm in a space, I'm bringing my most authentic self, one thing at a time
Yeah.
to get to where we got to go.
Kenisha, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about trauma and resilience in professional settings? What are some of the, I guess, the misconceptions and maybe based on the expectations from other people?
That's a great question. I've thought about this a little bit as we were preparing, and so many things like came to mind when we were talking about this. And two of the things that really stuck out to me were trauma is sometimes thought of as a personal failing or weakness. If you have some sort of trauma expectancy in your life or something has happened to you, that it's a weakness and you can't get past that. Another thing I think that's a misconception is the resilience piece, that the ability that we should just push through. And you've heard that saying, right? Pull your bootstraps, or probably saying it wrong, right? Like, what's the thing? The pull it by your bootstraps and push through, and you don't need therapy. In the Black community already, we see that therapy is looked down upon. It was for a very long time. It's stigmatized almost. But for me, I need support. So true resilience is really built when we build and create these conditions for ourselves for healing. Like when we bring people into our space that are going to help us, that we're not doing this alone. And when we're working at organizations, like that has to be present. And spaces like ERGs are so important for that, right? So we can go in and we can have conversations with like-minded folks who are going through the same things. A big ERG space I created for the state of Michigan when I was there was a space for multiracial, biracial people, because I always felt like I had to pick a side. And that came with the trauma for me growing up of having to pick a side. I felt like I had to pick a side. I didn't get exposure to my Black side. So here I am as a brown person, but was most would say growing up very quote unquote white acting, whatever that means. It's not a thing, but society would say that. I didn't get a lot of education outside of the very generic things. And all these things I had to teach myself later. But I think it's really important in work to have those spaces and being able to have that space to understand that sometimes trauma can be even replicated in the workplace. Like something can happen and trigger you, and you're like, whoa, I didn't think about that, or I couldn't remember what happened until now. Maybe it's a memory you repressed.
And so, based on your experience now, your personal experience and your experience obviously working with other people, how is today's backlash against DEI affecting employees who have these personal or generational traumas?
Just the exclusion of DEIB in the workplace right now is traumatizing in itself for folks. It's re-traumatizing us by communicating that inclusion was a trend. When I tell you that Target was my favorite store of all time, and I have not stepped foot in there like many other folks have not, right? When they take
Yep.
away all the program and say, we were just kidding about supporting everyone, like that really hurt. That really hurts. Do I shop some of the other big stores still? Yes, but I knew that they were like that before. Target played us a little bit and said, we were just kidding, and now we take it all back. But in the workplace, I've worked at some places that have had to roll back. I have friends that are losing their jobs. I was in a position that got eliminated right before the election because we knew it was coming for things like that, and some contracts that ended because of that. And just showing that it's a trend and it really wasn't a commitment. It's just really showing those true colors. And how am I supposed to show up and feel like I belong if there's not a space for me here to belong at?
That's a great question. And it leads me to my next question, which is, what do you believe is going to be the cost of this to employers from your perspective and the perspective of people around you who've had these traumas, who look at the company, and the expression you just used right now, if I were a leader at Target, would make shivers go up my back, which is when you just said, they played us. And how do you come back from that? I think that this is not one of those things where it's really easy for them to just kind of say, oops, we made a mistake, we're bringing it all back, because it's a hard thing to come back from. What do you believe will be the cost of this to employers?
There's going to be short-term things we're seeing, right? Lower morale, decreased engagement at work. I've had folks that I know personally that have resigned from their positions without being forced out. That's happened as well, the force out, but they have resigned from their positions because they didn't agree with the companies not going forward with the DE&IB work. Higher turnover of our marginalized populations because they don't feel supported and we don't feel like we have a space, right? But long term, reputational damage we're seeing all around right now, legal risks, and workplace culture that folks are not going to want to be at. So I have drafted a book I'm shopping around right now that really talks on, it's called Reimagining Equity, and it talks from a leadership role, and it maps out equity disinvestment loop. So once credibility is lost, how are you going to regain your employees' trust?
One of the things that this reminds me of is there was this old game that they used to play in school called Hawk and Dove. And when you played Hawk, you played like really aggressively against partners in the game. When you played Dove, you played more the role of someone who wanted to engage for mutual benefit. You wanted to partner. You wanted to create alliances. And one of the things that I used to hear the professor saying all the time is, the minute you play Hawk, it's very hard to go back to playing Dove, right? Because you've already shown that other side of you. And so I don't know how these companies are going to come back, because once they've shown that they basically were not really committed to all of these DEI efforts, how do they then turn around and say, oops, we were just under pressure, we didn't know what to do, we misunderstood? I don't know how you get out of that. Somebody more brilliant than me is going to have to come up with a solution for them, because I don't know how you come back from that. Okay, here is what I learned from the first half of our discussion with Kenisha. 1, trauma may stem from personal experiences or be passed down through generations via family behavior, survival strategies, or historical injustices like systemic racism. 2, trauma shows up in subtle but impactful ways at work. This includes imposter syndrome, code switching, perfectionism, and overworking, all of which can be coping mechanisms shaped by earlier life experiences or societal pressures. 3, common misconceptions about trauma is that people with dealing with trauma are somehow deficient or less capable. In reality, responding to trauma is a human experience, not a personal failing. 4, resilience isn't about pushing through alone. It's built by intentionally creating environments where people can seek help, process experiences, and connect with others who understand them. 5, the recent removal or minimization of inclusion efforts sent a message that belonging was a temporary initiative, which now re-triggered pain for those whose identities have historically been marginalized. And finally, 6, remember that individuals thrive when they are free to show up as their whole selves without needing to mask or conform to dominant norms, helping reduce the long-term effects of identity-based traumas. In the next half of our discussion with Kenisha, we're going to look at how ERGs can evolve into powerful spaces for healing trauma, building trust, and fostering strategic empowerment. All of this and more when we come back, but first this. I'll see you on the other side. Are you an ERG group or committee chair struggling to balance your ERG activities with your day job responsibilities? Well, you're not alone. There are hundreds of thousands of passionate ERG leads all around the world that find themselves in the same boat. The only solution found by many is to give up lunch hours and personal time with family and friends. But there is a better way, and that better way is to master the powerful skills that enable you to 1. Set realistic and achievable compelling goals and priorities. 2. Distribute the workload by effectively delegating tasks and responsibilities to others. 3. Communicate in a way that increases your impact with less time and effort on your part. 4. Secure the full and active support of executive sponsors and other senior business leaders. And 5. Fit your ERG leadership work into a reasonable set of time boundaries. And that and more is exactly what tens of thousands of your colleagues have learned to do effortlessly by participating in Supercharge Workshops. Supercharge Workshops was developed by us along the same easy and powerful how-to framework found in our popular Supercharge Your ERGs book. The modular, customizable programs are loaded with fun exercises and tools that will immediately give you back hours of time each day while increasing your ability to achieve high impact and measurable results in both your ERG work and your job. For more details on how you can schedule a Supercharge Workshop session in your organization, go to superchargeworkshops.com. That's https:// Supercharge Workshops, one word with no spaces.com. So don't suffer silently. Take that first step towards stopping your struggle today. Check out Supercharge Workshops. How can ERGs create safe spaces for members dealing with the effects of generational trauma and even direct trauma during this time of backlash? What are some of the things they can do?
Yeah, I definitely think that ERGs have to be set up in that safe, and I also add the word courageous space for members that are really dealing with these effects, right? Transitioning not just from offering support, but how can we make these healing-centered spaces and a space for us to be courageous to be able to come into? Is the person that's facilitating making sure that the space is trauma-informed? So what are your community agreements? What's the confidentiality piece going into this? You know, what I'm sure, right? What's learned here leaves here. What's said here stays here. So we're not going and sharing stories outside of that, right? And making sure that we have the space to be able to courageously tell our story and share how we're feeling. There should be workshops on emotional regulation and resilience through this time. I know that I've gone to several myself to build my capacity on that and just be in space with others who are really feeling the effects of everything that's going on in society right now. So just a space for collective strategizing and not just a venting space, but just a space that we can strategically talk about what are our next steps going to be, right? I really talk in the equity cohorts and spaces that I have about these courageous spaces, these brave spaces where we are vulnerable, we are joyful, and we are being transformational in that space too.
There was something you said at the very beginning, which I think is really critical. And it's something that I've used when I run focus groups, which is to make sure that you have a very clear understanding that what happens in the room stays in the room. We don't go out and tell stories about other people. We can use data and we could say the majority of people believe this, or there are several people who believe that.
Yes.
But we don't use names and say, oh, Kenisha said this and Jim said that and so forth. And I think that's really important. And then the other thing is that you highlighted there is this education piece, because it's unfortunate, but in most cultures in the United States and in parts of Europe and so forth, there is a tendency for people to blame themselves and to say, oh, this is my problem and I have to manage this, and it means that I'm weak if I can't control this. If I'm having a burnout situation
Yeah.
here, it's all me. I'm not strong enough to bounce back. And I think that education piece is important because it lets people be a little kinder to themselves and maybe start looking for a solution instead of bashing themselves. So, in addition to helping employees, I would imagine that ERGs can also help their organizations. Of course, that means that the organization has to listen to them. I would imagine that perhaps if companies like the aforementioned Target and others sat down with members of their community in these various groups and said, hey, we're facing this situation right now and we're thinking about what we're going to do. What do you think the impact of this would be on our business? What do you think the impact would be on our employees in general? They might have thought twice before they took the actions that they took. But that's not what happened. But what are some ways that ERGs can maybe raise their voice and get that information across, not only to help the community, but just to help the organization do a better job of addressing these challenges and not putting themselves in the kind of position that Target and some of these others have put themselves?
Yeah. I'm a very data-driven person. So I'd probably start to lead with that. Like you said, the focus groups and going in and speaking and having conversations with the folks in the affinity groups. Not just the affinity groups, but any change agents that there's probably folks in your organization that want to be part of an ERG that are not part of an ERG because maybe that distrust is there because in the past they've just had really bad experiences. So what can we do to collect and present both qualitative and quantitative data to leadership? And this comes from, you can use surveys or anonymous testimonies, a way to get back without folks feeling like they're going to be outed for telling their truth. And then partnering with consultants and stuff, third parties to come in and help you do that, because it's a little bit easier sometimes for folks at your agencies or your organizations to open up to folks who aren't in the picture all the time, right? That implicit bias isn't going to come into place, and we can remove some of those barriers to make it a little bit easier to have the conversation. So how can we move from the individual level, really? Like, of course, we want to be doing individual level work and making sure that every single person has their needs met, but it's going to take a whole systems change to be able to make that happen a little bit faster.
One of the stories I remembered while you were talking is several years ago, I worked for this organization, and one of the CEOs in the company wanted to connect better with people in the organization. And we had this big meeting and we had this discussion about different things that he could do, how he could, during a town hall, pose open questions and get real feedback from people, win their trust, make them comfortable in sharing what they were really thinking. Anyway, all planned out, goes in, starts doing the meeting, talks about two very ambitious projects. And one person who has been listening to all this and has gotten into their comfort level of, yeah, let's talk honestly here so that we can really get to the heart of things that need to be addressed. Anyway, this guy raises his hand and he says, how are we going to do this project and this project at the same time, since we only have a certain amount of resources that need to be shared between the two, and the timelines seem a little bit tight? The CEO's reaction to that question was, you are not informed enough on what's going on inside the company to know how we're going to do that. And that's why you're asking that question. But that, if you knew more about what was going on, you wouldn't ask that question. Next question. And it just like, it took the air out of the entire room. And later on, he was trying to analyze what happened, and he couldn't for the life of him see until a couple of us told him that he himself had shut the room down, because he could feel that the room shut down. And there were only few people in that room that were willing to tell him that. But my point in sharing that with you is that you're absolutely right about why sometimes you need an external person to do, because a lot of times when you have an internal person who already has very strong feelings about how things are or they should be, and they start asking questions and people start answering in ways that do not agree with what they think should be the kind of questions or the kind of answers. Their
Exactly.
immediate response is, you don't understand because, the senior team, we're doing this. Or you're misunderstanding what our intention is and whatever. And the minute you do that, you shut the room down. So usually, again, as I mentioned before, when I do focus groups, when I've done focus groups in the past, that's one of the things I do is I just listen and I say things like, say more about that. Tell me more. Does anybody else agree or disagree with that? And I just keep the conversation, but I don't shut them down by saying something like, you don't understand our priorities here in this company and what. The minute you do that, you might as well not have had that meeting. Really important to have, in some cases, either an outside person or really make sure that you're skilled up in what you're doing and that you know how to keep your own opinions to yourself during those discussions if you really want to get people to open up. So, with that, this is a good segue to the next question. What are skills for ERG leaders that they need to develop to become better equipped to navigate some of these challenges, like helping their members to cope better during these times of chaos, and two, helping their organizations?
Some very important things that come to mind for me are facilitation, right? Being able to have these conversations and, like you said, address the conflict without re-traumatizing folks, because I have been in rooms where folks have been re-traumatized by what someone has said to them when they were leading a conversation. And then they completely shut down and they will not say anything else to the conversation because of that. So you have to be very strategic with your communication. Talking about the hard truths, because we're not going to not talk about hard things. We're going to have hard discussions. The divisiveness already exists in the society, right? But we have to frame it in a certain way that it inspires actionable outcomes from leadership and from the folks who are in the group. Of course, other things like making sure that we have those ground rules, the boundary settings, and knowing how to sustain your energy without getting burnt out, and knowing when there's a stopping place and reading the room when we have to change subjects or whatever it may be. And then competency when it comes to coaching. So listening skills and asking powerful questions and holding space, policy and advocacy knowledge, all of those things of understanding how organizational change inward and outward works. I've done a lot of years of building up that in practice, and I have failed. I definitely have been in spaces where I've said something and I'm like, oh, I probably shouldn't have said it that way. And maybe it was because I led with a feeling rather than a facilitation method. If someone said something, depending on the room that I was in. And a lot of my evidence-based coaching research has brought a lot of this out and found that leaders who actually receive leadership coaching are better equipped to have these conversations. Putting yourself out there to get someone to help you capacity build in that space is going to be really good.
We've all had the experience that you just said where we felt like, oops, I just stepped on a landmine. And you hear that click and now you got to take your foot off it and it's going to explode.
Yeah.
We all had that experience. Now, one of the things that popped into my mind that I would add to what you said is that with all the skills, like if you have all the coaching skills and you have all the communication skills and everything else, the one question I think that's also important to ask yourself is, can I walk into this room and act like I'm somebody who is conducting a scientific inquiry as opposed to somebody who's an attorney for the company?
That part, yeah.
Because an advocate for the company, advocate for anything, I don't care if you're in legal, HR, or any other part of, if you walk in there thinking, well, my job is to support the business and to do this, you automatically are walking in there with a bias, and you automatically are going to channel that in the way you ask questions, the kind of questions that you fan on, that you basically want to expand on and build on, and the ones that you want to suppress. And people will pick up on that right away. They'll pick up that this is not an authentically open conversation searching for truth. This is a session where you're trying to channel me in a particular direction. People today are very savvy, very interconnected. They're going to pick up on that right away. If you can walk in there, instead of walking in there as an attorney who already has a concept of how they want this trial to go and what kind of picture they want to paint. If you go in there as someone who is curious and who says, I want to know what these people really feel and think. I want to understand better. I want to not prejudge any of this or take any particular position in defense of either senior leadership or myself or the way we do things today, but rather learn from people how they're perceiving us and what they think and what it is that they need. If you walk in with that, then with all those skills and everything, you're in a much better position. I think that was something that you implied in there as part of the whole package, but it really needs to be underscored because it is probably one of the most critical things. Yeah. Resources. What resources do you recommend for our listeners who say, you know what, I want to become good at this. I want to support my members and my group. What are some things they should go out and get? Books to read, things to listen to, et cetera, et cetera. You talked about your own book that you're putting together. I'm sure articles that you've published, anything that's out there that people can use to learn more, to help them be better at working with people on trauma, whether it's generational or direct trauma that they're suffering from.
Yeah, so I do have another book that is published that's called And Then She Persisted, that really talks about my personal narrative of resilience and trauma and systemic change, where my up-and-coming Reimagining Equity really focus on those practical frameworks for equity-centered system change. So I have my memoir, and then I have this is what we're going to do with it. So coming up behind it. Also, literally anything by Dr. Kendi, Ibram X. Kendi. He is one of my true heroes in anti-racism work, and he has so many gems inside his books, How to Be Anti-Racist, and all of his narratives. There's a really amazing card deck that he has that helps you have conversations in some of your ERG spaces. I used to use all the time. It's anti-racist conversation cards, and it's like a card deck that you can pull out questions and start your conversation if you need a little help and guidance in some of those spaces. Training and capacity building, there's agencies like Crossroads organization, or one, I am from the state of Michigan, and there's a agency called ERACE, ERACCE, and they do some national work as well, and they have like anti-racism, systemic racism workshops that are life-changing. So just even taking some steps to start to do that, to dive in a little bit deeper, are some ways that we can dig in further.
And final question, how can our listeners reach you?
I am most active on LinkedIn. So I'm always writing and posting articles about these different things. I have some evidence-based coaching articles on LinkedIn and some others that I have published about some of my research. My website is www.kenishacoon.com. And you can find me on Instagram too. I'm pretty active on there, but LinkedIn is like the best way to get a hold of me. And I offer keynotes and coaching, but a lot of my work is really focused on DEIB strategy consulting. So how can we start ERGs? How can we do equity-based coaching and leadership coaching? And I'd love to connect with anyone who's interested in doing some of that work.
Kenisha, thank you again for joining us today on ERG PowerTalk.
Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
Okay, here is what we got from the second half of our discussion with Kenisha. 1, ERG should move beyond support groups to intentionally cultivating healing and courageous spaces. Places where vulnerability, storytelling, and shared experiences are honored and supported by trained facilitators who understand trauma. 2, set clear confidentiality guidelines. For example, what's said here stays here. To protect trust and psychological safety, these agreements should also include respectful listening and non-judgmental engagement. 3, offer workshops or peer sessions on emotional regulation, burnout recovery, and collective care strategies to help members process pain and maintain well-being during turbulent times. 4, while emotional release is valuable, ERG should also create a space for members to strategically process challenges and co-develop next steps or action plans that empower change and advocacy. 5, collect anonymous quantitative and qualitative data to surface themes and trends, and then present this data to your senior leadership in ways that drive organizational awareness and can influence better decision-making. You can do this with external support when you feel trust is fragile. And finally, 6, leaders should build skills in trauma-informed facilitation, coaching, boundary setting, and advocacy. This includes knowing when to shift topics, how to hold space without re-traumatizing people, and how to frame hard truths for action. A while back, I came across a story of a nurse named Carla in a mid-sized healthcare organization. Carla was once withdrawn and on the verge of quitting her job, but she had the opportunity to share in a trauma-informed ERG session how the loss of her brother during the pandemic had left her numb and feeling disconnected. In that space where her story was met with empathy instead of silence, she not only began healing, but soon started leading peer support circles among her own team and other groups. And over the next year, staff turnover in her group dropped and team cohesion improved dramatically. A senior leader who learned about this later remarked, "When we made room for pain, we uncovered passion." Carla and her team's transformation reminded the entire organization's leadership that healing isn't a detour from performance. It's the path toward it. So I urge you to create spaces where stories of pain can be shared with empathy, because when we make room for healing, we make room to unlock the passion and resilience that drives you, your organization, and your entire community of members forward. Thank you for tuning in to ERG Power Talk. If you enjoyed and got value out of this program, please like us and leave a favorable review at your podcast provider's site. Also, invite others to listen to the show. By the way, contact me if you're looking for an ERG Symposium keynote or a leader for your strategy workshop, new chair onboarding, and or ERG bootcamp. I can run these for you either in person or in a virtual setting. Also, for more great ideas and tips for your ERGs, get my books, Supercharge Your ERGs, 18 Tips to Power Up Your ERG/BRG Strategy, and the new DEI and ERG Frontier, how you and your efforts can rise and thrive in the new world of constant disruption. Both available on Amazon.com. I'm Joe Santana. Thanks again for tuning in.